Good morning.
Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, everyone. That's a fancy sign you have there, Chad.
Yeah.
That looks good.
Yeah. I just threw it together.
Threw it together. That takes a long time to do those things. Looks great.
No, it really took just a minute. I
Oh,
got
really?
well, I already have the image file. That's old. And I just added the text to it.
Nice.
But yeah, just to let people know because we have usually give people a few minutes to get connected because not everybody gets on at the same time.
Yeah. Scott's painting the hallway right now, so he'll be on in a minute. I said, no, don't stop painting. Just when you're finished, join the meeting.
We'll just wait a couple more minutes for people to get connected and then we'll start. All right, but we'll go ahead and get started. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. This is the May meeting of the Canary Islanders Heritage Society of Louisiana. We have a few announcements before we get to the presentation today. Let me find my notes real quick because I'm gonna get thrown off really easily. So the first thing is that this weekend, the Destrehan Plantation is having their Heritage Weekend. So if you're in the South Louisiana area and you want to go by there, it's pretty much all day today and tomorrow. It's kind of the first, I guess, festival to take place since the things with the pandemic are starting to get back to normal. One of the exhibits they're going to have at the festival is History of the Isleños, which is presented by Bill Hyland and Ben Crow, who are with the St. Bernard Canary Islanders group. Our own treasurer, Steve Estopanel, will also be there. So if you want to attend that, we're probably going to be making a change to our meeting schedule. So we may not have a June meeting where the board is still discussing the possibility of switching the meetings from a monthly basis to more of a quarterly basis. The reason for that is to have more time to put together a better program and better presentations. We feel like that better quality of what we present is going to draw a better audience, and it's going to also give us more time between meetings to promote the upcoming meeting and to let people know what we're going to be talking about, so we can get some good turnout on the Zoom meetings. We're looking at going back to meeting at the library in Baton Rouge. But when we do that, we are going to still have the Zoom calls as well. We'll have a camera set up and you'll be able to connect to the meeting via Zoom. But we hope that if you're in the area and you're able to come to Baton Rouge, we hope that you would come in person because we miss seeing everybody in person at our meetings. For those of you who don't know already, if you can trace your lineage back to one of the Canary Islanders who came over with the migration under Governor Galvez and served under him in the militia, you're eligible to join the SAR or the DAR. That's the Sons of the American Revolution or Daughters of the American Revolution. The Daughters of the American Revolution have started a new chapter called the Canary Islands chapter. It's recognizing some of the patriots who were part of that migration. I went to their, I keep forgetting the word for it. Their not inaugural, anyway, their first meeting basically. And I spoke at their meeting and they had a pretty good turnout. So that's something. If you need help with your genealogy or need help with that process, you can let us know. There's some of us in the group who are members of those organizations already, and some of us like me who are still working on getting that set up. One other thing is, in October, our society will actually be celebrating its 25th anniversary. We were started in 1996, so we are 25 years old. So we're starting to talk about plans for that and getting organized to have some sort of an anniversary celebration. So we'll have more information about that as we get closer to that date. And if anybody has any ideas, any input, any suggestions, as always, please let us know. You can always email me, president@canaryislanders.org. And that you can email me with anything. I think that's all the announcements we have for now. So today's presentation is going to be a little bit different. Our Vice President, Wade Falcon, had another commitment, so he can't be with us on the meeting to do his presentation. However, thanks to Zoom and technology and the magic of all that, he recorded his presentation for us, and we'll be able to, so I'll be able to show the presentation to you. I'll share my screen, and you should see the video and hear the audio of him presenting. Obviously, you won't be able to ask him any questions because he's not really here. It's just a recording, but you can put questions in the chat if you'd like to. And if any of us on the call are able to answer it, we'll respond in the chat. Or if you want to hold your questions to the end, Wade may be able to join us via audio toward the end of the meeting. But if he doesn't, you can always email your questions to me, and I'll make sure to get those over to him. So hopefully the technology will not betray me, and we will get this presentation going here. Let's see. All right, I'm working on the sound issue here. Just give me a moment, please. Sorry. I know there's a setting somewhere that says share the sound too. Just gotta find it. Ah, I got it now. Okay. All right, sorry about that.
Welcome to my presentation on the Spanish conspiracy of 1787 through 1797. This is an interesting topic to me because I had ran into this information doing Isleña work, and I was really curious to know what happened after Spain acquired Louisiana. You know, what was going on, and especially after the United States acquired everything else up to the, after the war, up to the Spanish international line of the Mississippi River. And it's quite interesting because we think after the American Revolution, everything kind of calmed down. And that's not quite so. The United States was really split into two pieces. But you had the colonies on one side, but you had what's called the interior of North America on the other side. And those two things were completely different. They were different culture, different type of people, and Spain had to work with that. They had to figure out the dynamics of what was going on in this very fragile new country of the United States, because that was on their border, and they had to do something. So, I don't know of a lot of people who know about this topic, quite frankly. I really got sidetracked into it. And keep in mind, there's a lot of characters in the story. But most of it revolves around a guy named James Wilkinson. We're going to get into him a little bit. I'm not going to go into the history of too many other areas within the newly acquired western frontier of the United States. The stuff that was on the Spanish border, but I will definitely approach those topics. I will try not to get too deep into them. So here we have maps. I love maps. We have this map of, the United States, and you can see where the colonies were, but you can see in pink to the left, that's the interior. And of course, in yellow, you see, what was Spanish, in 1763. And that Mississippi just kind of rides along that line. And, the people in that area where it says Indian Reserve and the Ohio River, it wasn't as calm and peaceful after the war as people think. This area was still kind of contentious. And we're going to go into that. There were different people there. We got a map of 1762, the earliest Spanish map, and you can see where all the Spanish lands were. You see the Mississippi River in the middle. And of course, to the right of that is what's known as the interior of the United States. They had just acquired this the following year. And it's full of rivers, it's full of Indian territory, and it's quite loosely populated. The population there was sparse. It was different. They weren't the same kind of people, and they didn't have the same kind of thought process as those along the eastern seaboard in the colonies. Especially, they were a far cry from what was going on in New England. Let's put it that way. Here we can see. I talk a little bit about the Spanish forts around the Mississippi. After 1783, the war was over, and Spain's goal was to fortify La Louisiane, which was on the left side of the river, and for the most part, and they were fortifying against the American interior. It really stretched all the way down the Ohio River Valley, and it reached the most southwestern point. You can see where it says the Mississippi Territory in blue, and it shows the south of the Ohio River in blue. That's really the furthest southwestern point of the new United States. And that area down there was known as Fort Adams. It had been reclaimed in the Tunica Hills from Post Rocha d'Avion. All right. And to this day, that territory is mostly encompassed with present-day Mississippi and Alabama. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. The British had their had the line all the way at 32 parallel, and the United States had claimed south to the 31st, but Spain kind of refused to do so. In the next map, you can we talk a little bit that Spain had claimed the line actually at the Yazoo Junction, where the Yazoo and the Mississippi River meet. But that wasn't always understood by other international countries. The other nations didn't always agree on this. To complicate things, the state of Georgia actually itself claimed all of that region as West Georgia. All right, they actually called it the County of Bourbon, believe it or not. But no one ever really tried to fight over this area. And you can see underneath it says British West Florida. Above that is the Choctaw and Creek nations and other Indian nations. Spain really, really wanted this area, not necessarily to populate it, but to keep it as a buffer zone from New Orleans. They didn't want the Americans encroaching upon New Orleans. That was their jewel, right? That was the whole goal here. So after the war, after 1784, much of the American westward expanding territories, those into the interior, they had very little in common with New England and the Virginia colonies. Like we said, it was sparsely populated. New Englanders were interested in shipping rights and their privileges for their economies. Kentuckians could have cared less. Their interest lied in getting the tobacco crops to market. So in reality, many northern states were happy with the idea of actually two confederations, one in the north and the other in the south and west. So it was an interesting time. In comes our first character. His name's James Wilkinson. He actually served in the Continental Army as a senior officer, but he had a reputation for disloyalty. He actually embellished his own role at the victory of Saratoga. Um, he was appointed in 1777 as a board of war. Um, he tended to gossip a lot and indicated that he tried to indicate that he was going to replace George Washington, with Horatio Gates as the commander in chief. And he ended up kind of getting booted out of the military, and he resigned in 1778. Um, um, he joined the Pennsylvania militia in 1782, and he became an assemblyman. And he moved to the far western part, right, of Virginia. Today we know that as Kentucky. And he began secret efforts to achieve independence from Virginia. He had crossed over the mountains. He was eager to profit from the fertile Kentucky fields. He became a land speculator, and then, like a lot of people, he promptly fell into debt. Um, and so he found a different lucrative form of survival. He was going to sell American secrets to the Spanish Empire. Right, yeah. The way he would do this, he would send the information as code, numbers of groups of four. It was never broken, interestingly enough. He actually informed the Spanish of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Of course, everybody knows about them. He suggested that they send armed patrols to intercept the expedition. And guess what? The Spanish actually tried to do that. They failed to find Lewis and Clark, though. And so, again, he was constantly giving the Spanish advice on what to do. I want to take this time actually to show you on this slide all of the Spanish forts along the Mississippi. I'm not going to go through each one of these. That's actually another presentation I hope to do in the future. But you can see the different forts that were either previous French forts that became Spanish. Some of these Spanish forts had moved from the eastern side of the Mississippi to the western side once the Americans got hold of the land. So, once Spain got the ability to build a fort on the Louisiana side, on the western side, they did. Some of them were English forts that they had taken over at the time. And others they just built themselves. The next slide, I tried to do my best to put positions of where a bunch of these forts were located. You can see everything at the north of what's, I guess, around northern Illinois, known as the Mines of Spain. And there was a lot of fortifications, old French forts around St. Louis. I want you to note that there was a city named New Madrid. That's how they pronounce it up there, New Madrid. There was more forts. Most of the fortification was, as you can see, in the southern port of Louisiana, more or less in and around New Orleans. In fact, there were many inside the city of New Orleans. I don't represent them here. In 1780, Kentucky and Tennessee asked to be part of the Confederation of States, but Congress kept postponing the matter. And after the war in 1783, they noticed that Spain was controlling the Mississippi, but at the time they really didn't restrict the commerce up and down. So the Americans were enjoying the access to and from the Mississippi River. You got to understand they were trying to move materials. It was hard to move materials overland, over the Appalachian Mountains. It was very difficult. It was also very difficult to move their goods through the Great Lakes, over water. The easiest was down the Mississippi River. For those living in the interior, that this was beneficial. New Orleans also, and the Caribbean and other places were also beneficial to buying some of this stuff. In 1784, Spain closed the Mississippi River. They were just scared. They were scared that all of this new traffic, all these Americans bringing their goods up and down the Mississippi River would cause them to want to settle and move into the new Spanish territory. And because they were fearful, they basically shut it down. They said any American venturing past its borders without a passport risked arrest. Well, guess what? That didn't go so well up north. When the Kentuckians protested this to the U.S. government, they were ignored. In 1785, Representative Jay and Spanish Representative Gardoki, they began negotiations. Jay decided to work a better deal with the northeastern states instead. Basically, what he said, he said, look, Spain will, open up your ports on the mainland in the Mediterranean islands, in the Canary Islands and the Azores to U.S. ships. And if you do that, we'll relinquish all the rights to the river for 30 years. You see, Jay really was more interested in fishing rights than he was about the river. And talk about that angered the Kentuckians even more, to the point of taking the river and even the city of New Orleans by force. Wilkinson saw this. He had a plan. He was going to take advantage of this anger and create a trading monopoly with Spain, one that he would dominate. He would convince the local population that he was ready for this, the George Washington of the West. And he would secretly advocate for Kentucky succession, form a new nation, and open up the river. But that's not really the whole story. What he was trying to really do was become the only person to be able to trade with the Spanish territory. He was really the only one that would benefit in this process if he could become president of the new Kentucky country. So he began, and in May 1785, he approached Kentucky and Tennessee, and they declared themselves independent through a declaration drawn up. And in 1786, Congress accepted some Spanish proposals about borders and trade and navigations, but they really didn't touch the Mississippi River too much in their discussions. And Gardoki kind of stepped in. He was the Spanish official, and he says, it might be time to look at the separation of the District of Kentucky for real. So you had Spain on board for the first time, Letters were started to get published in the local newspapers, rousing up the local populace as if war was imminent. 1787, a letter circulated around saying that an allegiance of Westerners could be thrown to Great Britain if they don't declare secession. Ohio River region threatened to raise 20,000 troops to march against the Spanish. A North Carolina convention delegate, Williamson, had large Western land holdings, and he said that they could raise up to 60,000 men capable of bearing arms. Another one claimed 50,000 men could be raised on the frontier to keep the river open. You can already see the anger that the Americans had with the closing of the river and that they were ready to go to war. In 1787, Wilkinson arrived in New Orleans. It was a very controversial visit. He was there to see the General Miro. He was going to create that monopoly between Kentucky and Spanish New Orleans. Of course, that would have allowed him to bring all of his own shipments down there, and anyone else doing that, they would seize the ships and cargo. And so he left Kentucky in 87 with a full flatboat full of tobacco, bacon, ham, and flour. On his way down, he worked past different Spanish settlements. He persuaded all those officials to let him pass. He gave some horses to some Natchez officials. Believe it or not, his cargo arrived in New Orleans before he did. And through some correspondence, they told him, look, this man is very popular in Kentucky. If you seize this property, those Kentuckians might actually go to war with us down here. And so the Spanish authorities decided not to seize his cargo, and they waited for his arrival. He actually offered Miro a proposition, and this is the conspiracy. He said, look, if you allow me to have a monopoly over all the river trade, I'll use my influence in Kentucky to promote Spain's interests. I'll prevent an invasion of Westerners that are ready to take the Mississippi by force and bring Kentucky into the Spanish orbit. If only Spain would open up the river. And if they don't, they might fall to the British. Basically, if Kentucky didn't become Spanish, it might become British. That was his conspiracy. That was the whole thing. And believe it or not, it worked. He obtained a pension, a nice position in Kentucky, and basically laid out everything in the paperwork saying, I'm no longer an American citizen. I will fight for Spain. I am resolved to seek my happiness and fortune in Spain, basically becoming a Spanish citizen on paper. And it worked. He got the monopoly he was looking for. He recommended to the Spanish government that they appoint an American agent in Kentucky. Of course, he was talking about himself the whole time. He secretly asked Miro to keep the Mississippi River closed to anybody else, you know. And so Spain did so, and they employed him and they paid him. And little did Wilkinson know, Miro didn't actually trust him. He actually knew that his intention was to enrich himself instead. In the meantime, Wilkinson headed back and he raised hell in the Kentucky Assembly, saying the United States should do something to open the river. Of course, something he knew George Washington couldn't do. That made the Kentuckians very eager to drop their ties with America and accept any new terms with Spain. Most fellow Kentuckians viewed him as a hero, mainly because of his success. And he really thought at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 would buy all he needed. That's all he would need, you know. This was Oliver Pollock. And basically he was interested in Wilkinson's plan. And he was questioning why Governor Miro was allowing all this tobacco to come down the river in large quantities. And so he learned about Wilkinson, and he went back and he kind of questioned what was going on in the territory. He said, look, I'm not 100% sure that Kentucky is interested in independence. You know, I'm pretty sure they want to be part of Congress, just like the territory of Illinois. I think they want to be part of the United States. Meanwhile, Wilkinson's reaping all of these lavish profits and living a lifestyle, and basically he proposed independence for Kentucky in 1787. But when he gets to Kentucky, he finds out most of the population failed to support this. And so he quickly stops advocating for it in the state. The only problem is he doesn't tell the Spanish this. And so when the Seventh Constitutional Convention occurred, it was clear Kentucky would join the United States, and there were several petitions violently opposing the independence of Kentucky. And Wilkinson had to backtrack everything he was saying in the state. Meanwhile, there were some other things going on in Tennessee. A man named James Robertson was carving out a couple of areas of Tennessee. He was also trying to get the good graces of the Spanish crown. In fact, he did so by carving out two areas. He carved out the one area called the Washington District, and he carved out another area he called the Miro District in order to, you know, be friendly with the Spanish. He thought we could bring in the Tennessee District in and help and maybe woo the Spanish into opening the river in a different way. And so you can see that map there where it shows the Miro District. Yeah, how's that? So Wilkinson had some competition here. At the same time, Great Britain is seeing all this, and they decide to support Kentucky and Tennessee independence as well. The Lord Buckingham in 1786 came up with a plan. He said, look, we're going to commit to 100,000 pounds to Illinois, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee conventions. We'll create a militia down there with Clark, Tate, and Greene. We'll attack Louisiana in the north and the south. We'll use the Mississippi and Missouri rivers to join the American militias. We'll stir up revolts with the French and English people in Louisiana. So the British tried to do this. It was a huge plot they put together, except the plot failed, and some of the conspirators were arrested. Some escaped. Yeah, so failed plot there. So in 1788, Wilkinson actually returns back to Kentucky, and he finds that his little group of separatists were strongly opposed to the new constitution everybody was talking about. They wanted closer ties with Spain. In fact, they called them the Spaniardized Republicans. Thought that was kind of neat. Back in Spain, The Crown rejected Wilkinson's plan, believe it or not. They did not want him to form a commission. They did not want him to be granted a pension. And unless they could prove that Kentucky actually establishes its own independence, they were telling Miro not to go forward with any of this stuff. They did not want to stir the pot. You understand? Not from the Spanish crown point. But look, he was undeterred. He went back to New Orleans again, and he blamed his failure on the Constitution of 1787. He also blamed Spain. He said, look, your silence is not helping us here. It's leading to fear. And of course, he requested more money, right? Naturally. He hoped to get pensions for some of his allies. But there was other competition Wilkinson had. Cardoque was basically being told in New York, look, if you engage and open the navigation to Mississippi, I think Kentucky will declare their independence. He was being told this by John Brown, their delegate. Also, Cardoque at the same time was receiving other offers to create independence. George Morgan was going north of the Ohio looking to settle a Spanish colony. He helps create the town of New Madrid, in Missouri. So if you're familiar with that town, that's kind of how that gets created. And for the next 10 years, Wilkinson continued to write to the Spanish in Louisiana, hinting that any moment now Kentucky's going to be independent. Okay. In 1789, his entire plan gets rattled. The Spanish Council of the Indies authorized opening up the river for Westerners willing to pay a tax. And Wilkinson just realized his monopoly was fading, and so he writes to Miro saying, for God's sake, cut off the commercial intercourse with this country. It's going to destroy our plans. It's going to ruin Louisiana, and so he would have to try to work out something in a different way. So now we're at part 2. We're going to introduce our next character. His name's Manuel de Gayoso. And Wilkinson feels defeated, okay, at this point. But he decides to go, there's a different way. He decides, hey, I'm going to go into the spying business, all right? And he gets assigned secret agent number 13. And he's promised a pension for his efforts in spying for Spain. He enjoys a nice pension of $2,000 yearly, all right? And basically it's laundered money as if it was profits from tobacco sales or something, okay? Miro requests that him and the Natchez governor, all right, Manuel de Gayoso, they work undercover and see which one of these Western settlers are willing to break away and join Spain and maybe kind of stir the pot insurrection-wise. And so Gayoso becomes the go-between guy between Wilkinson and at Natchez, right, in 1789. Wilkinson basically comes back and supplies all the names of these big, real important Kentucky guys who would be corrupted by Spanish gold. Gayoso secretly agrees to hand some land over to him as a future payment if the plan ever succeeds. So there's something in it for Wilkinson. He could get, not only get paid, but he could also get land in the Natchez district, all right? In 1790, the United States government attempts to establish a route from Kentucky to New Orleans. And when Wilkinson learns of the plan, he has the Indians attack the people building the road. This story actually gets intercepted by President Washington. And he goes on a rampage saying, he's going to bring him to court and hang him if he ever finds Wilkinson. And it's about this time that Miro has figured out Wilkinson will never become an important person through this trade. Except there's only one problem. In 1791, Miro is actually replaced by Carondelet. All right, Francisco Luis Hector de Carondelet. Carondelet, I don't know. This is how I say it. Maybe I'll say it differently. On the side note, the French are kind of watching this from the sidelines, and Genet, all right, he arrives in 1793. He also tries to form an alliance with Kentucky. He wants to get Louisiana away from Spain. He actually wants to return it back to French control. This is rarely talked about in history books, but France kind of wanted their Louisiana back, believe it or not, and they tried in 1793 to do that. They had a guy named George Clark, with a campaign to seize New Madrid, St. Louis, Natchez, New Orleans, and he was going to get assistance and win the support of the Kentucky governor. In fact, Clark himself spent over $4,600 in supplies of his own money, except the word got out. All right, and when that happened, Gayoso sent 300 militiamen to New Orleans to defend it against this French invasion. They heard about troops moving to the frontier. All right. Carondelet spent almost 300,000 in excess funds that the king had for defenses. Meanwhile, President Washington issued out a proclamation forbidding any Americans violating the neutrality. Right. So basically, the seeds of war are brewing right now on the border between Spain, France, and the United States. All right. And when all this plot fizzled out, Gayoso realized maybe a Spanish buffer in Kentucky might not be such a bad idea after all. So they kind of revisited the idea. And so we have our second attempt at Spanish Kentucky. All right. So scared of war, and the Spanish, the Spanish decided to beef up their defenses along the river. They started building forts, outfitting ships. They raised a militia themselves. They put a fort at Nogales, what's known as Walnut Hills at the time. They put cannons there, powder magazines. And so at the same time, Carondelet basically sent a man named Thomas Power. That was his agent. He went to meet up with Gayoso and Wilkinson to check out the situation in Kentucky. He left New Orleans with $100,000 to start a revolution in Kentucky. He was to tell them that there was going to be a new Spanish province carved out, and it would stretch all the way to Ohio, from Ohio all the way down to the Yazoo. And once the revolution was underway, they would bring more money. You see, so that was kind of like the enticement for that. In fact, here you can see a letter, some documentation of Gayoso talking about establishing that fort at Walnut Hills. You can see in the map where it says Nogales up there. And so Gayoso sails up the Mississippi to visit these alleged Spanish settlements. His official story was to inspect the defenses there, but he had secret instructions. He was going to meet with these Kentuckians, these prominent men, all right, and see if they were ready to sow the seeds of separation, essentially, all right. In fact, they were inspired by reports of the Whiskey Rebellion, and that maybe some Westerners weren't too happy with the United States government, And so as Gayoso moves his way up north, he's finding something different. He's finding apathy. Whatever, support that they had for Kentucky separation had kind of fizzled out. In fact, he ends up finding out that President Adams has ordered his arrest, so he's very eager to get out of there. And he says the dissatisfaction amongst these people 4 years ago has quietened down. There is no more interest in separation after all. One of the problems with Wilkinson doing all this spying and all this corruption is that he was getting paid for this intelligence through coins stored in barrels. In fact, that was the only way he could transport his very loud, unwieldy payments, in these silver dollars at the time. He packed them in casks, he put them in sugar and coffee, he shoved the coins in bottles of rum. But as the coins were clinking around, everybody knew that there was money on this shipment headed north. In fact, at some point, some of the people who were working with him, they took the money and tried to scatter the money across the Kentucky countryside. They were caught, and Williamson, believe it or not, escaped as an innocent man. Even though he was a spy, he never got He never got ousted, you know. His entire spying effort actually almost gets uncovered by sheer luck. A man named Anthony Wayne had become very, you know, important amongst Washington's generals, and Wilkinson was very jealous of him. In fact, I think it's all because Wayne had refused to invite him to his Christmas party or something like that, right? Okay. In fact, Wilkinson tried to criticize Wayne's actions at a certain battle, all these things. Wayne decided to fight back. He launched an investigation into Wilkinson, figuring out, where's all this money coming from? Why is all this tobacco headed down there? How is all this information getting flown into Spanish hands? Are you a spy? And before Wilkinson can get busted, Wayne ends up getting an ulcer and dies. And some people think he might have been poisoned by Wilkinson. So, very dangerous game out there in the spying world, I guess, you know. What happens next basically is the downfall of the entire conspiracy. We have our two new characters. It's Manuel de Godoy and Thomas Pinckney. Basically, Spain had spent so much money in war by 1794, they had lost a lot of the Caribbean and European territories. And when Jay's Treaty was signed that year, Spain was fearful that Britain and the United States would become friends. And so, fearing another war with the United States and knowing they couldn't win, basically they kind of surrendered their control over any disputed territory north of the 31st parallel. Pinckney arrived in Spain in 1795 to meet with Godoy, and he offered that, 31st parallel as the border around the United States where Florida border is today. And most of the Americans were very enthusiastic about this. The only thing is Pinckney kind of threatened to leave without signing the treaty unless Spain dropped all duties on American trade passing through New Orleans. And so they agreed, and it went into effect in 1796. Now, Spain settled that border at 31st parallel, but it had been very much disputed. All that area around the Natchez district, everything we were talking about earlier in the maps where Mississippi and Alabama are, a good chunk of that, Spain had kind of had buyer's remorse. They really didn't want to give up that area, honestly. Believe it or not, they even after signing the treaty, for 2 years they presented numerous excuses for not leaving the area. They've actually sent reinforcements to hold the Natchez. Gayoso tried to create a division among the landowners, try to create a revolution in the region, He claimed that British loyalists in the area were talking about an English invasion, So that kind of delayed the Spain from leaving. Meanwhile, the Americans had already sent out surveyors to scope out the new property, but it took them 6 months to get there. When Ellicott and Freeman arrived, they met, at a meeting place with Carondelet, and Gayoso began protesting the hoisting of the American flag. He was protesting against U.S. troops being there, the arresting of deserters, and all these other alarming stories. He was telling them about the Indians. And as Gayoso was evacuating the fort, Ellicott's army kind of moved on. And a few days later, Gayoso and the artillery, they hurried back into the forts and remounted. Gayoso then issued a proclamation saying he's keeping possession of this Natchez countryside until the inhabitants could, keep their property and be assured that the Indians would be pacified. He made all sorts of claims, He said, I need to hear from the Spanish Majesty first before we leave the area. All sorts of excuses, all right? But basically, it didn't hold up. He even kind of went on to say, there's pretext to war here. The British are going to come from Canada and they're going to attack Louisiana any moment. I need to stay in the Natchez. And all the Americans there, they started to create militias. They were scared. They started to believe this man that there was going to be a battle about to rage any day now in this region. Ellicott and his supporters, they declared all these excuses invalid and said, look, any more troops that arrive here would be considered an attack upon the United States. Anything north of the 31st parallel would be an attack. And here you can see a map of that actual district, the Natchez district, and the lines over time that were drawn further and further down that eventually become American territory. And Spain only gets that bottom western Florida piece that we're more familiar with today. You got to understand, Goyoso had property, a lot of property around Natchez, so it was in his best interest to defend this and keep it for Spain. He had a self-interest in that. So, yeah. Believe it or not, it took the Americans 2 years to survey that boundary with the U.S. Army, and even the Spanish Prime Minister believed Gayoso about all of the concerns and the scenarios he was inventing and making up. But in the end, Madrid informed him that, look, you need to evacuate Natchez and Nogales forts, decommission these things, and by 1798, Spain relinquished everything up to the 31st parallel line. Natchez district was no longer Spanish, and the emissaries, they returned to New Orleans from Tennessee and Kentucky, convinced there was no longer any hope of a Spanish dominion in that region. And this conclusion really sums it up. Daniel Clark in his memoir basically said, look, Governor Miro he's a weak man. He doesn't understand the American government. He's even ignorant of the position of Kentucky with his own province. But he was alarmed at the idea of Kentucky men. He feared them, because he didn't know their strength. And that's kind of what drove this whole thing. He just didn't know. Believe it or not, Wilkinson served a lot of official posts over the next several years. He was involved in the Aaron Burr conspiracy in Texas in the War of 1812. He published his own memoirs in 1816, trying to clear his name. And you can see now below, you can actually see here in the next slide some of the Spanish documents that were uncovered in the Spanish archives in Seville. You can see them talking about the Kentucky separation. This one's from the governor of Havana discussing it. And the next one, you can see the same thing where they're talking about Kentucky again. And so that concludes our story. It never really happens. All of it was a bunch of rhetoric, and luckily the American interior held itself together, and Spain retained its Louisiana, and they never went to war. All the militias faded away, and normally, and a lot of people just don't know about this history. I think it's kind of neat that this came to head amongst 2 and 3 and maybe even 4 major international superpowers of the time were willing to go over war over the interior of North America, and Spanish Louisiana was in the heart of it all. Anyway, so here's some of the sources I used. The best one, I think, really is the Linklater's book, An Artist in Treason. Basically, the double life of General James Wilkinson. A lot of information came from there, but fascinating story. I think it's really neat, and I appreciate you guys if y'all stuck around this long to listen to all this. You have any questions, I'll try to answer them later, or you can always contact the society. And I appreciate you guys for being here, and hope to hear from you soon. Thanks.
Wade Falcon has joined us now. That was great, Wade. Very good. Very thorough. A lot of content there. It's a really interesting story, though.
Yeah, I think I just got attracted to what was going on after the war. And I know it wasn't, today's topic really wasn't about Canary Islands, but it was about, you know, our Spanish history. And I think just all of Spanish Louisiana has always fascinated me. That's kind of why it drove me to look more into this story. And the more I looked into it, man, there was a lot of just espionage and just backstabbing and you know, the shady business tactics of moving money, how, you know, the coins rattling in the barrels and, you know, him almost getting caught as a spy. I mean, this is like Hollywood to me, you know, but in the 1700s. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of movie I want to see instead of seeing, you know, the 10th remake of the same movie I've already seen before.
So if anyone has any questions, I'm actually online now. So for the next 10, 15 minutes, if y'all have anything, just let me know.
Could write a book about this, Wade.
Well, that last slide shows all the books, you know,
Yeah, but you
where
could write
much
it.
of it came from. So, you know,
Right.
yeah.
That was really great. Thank you. You always research so well.
All right, good. I hope that I was able to put it in a context that was easy to consume. There's a lot of dates, there's a lot of characters. And how do you present that in 30, 45 minutes without losing everyone? So I like to think I stuck to the topics that were most interesting and paint the picture that's needed. But again, if y'all have any questions, if I said something dumb, point it out. If you know, if something was missing or y'all know about this story even more so, then let me know. You know, just kind of neat.
Does anybody have any questions for Wade about the presentation?
I don't have any questions, but I think it was great, Wade. Very good.
Cool.
You know, I know we've been to Natchez a couple of times, but how much of Spanish influence do you know? Maybe you know this or maybe not. Can you find evidence of this in Natchez today?
I didn't gather. I haven't been to Natchez,
Mhm.
but I didn't gather in what I was doing that there was too much. It really was an abandoned piece of property that, if you go back to the 1500s, Spain claimed Florida all the way up to the Chesapeake.
Sure.
Seriously, like that was a bold claim. Okay, they never could hold that claim. That area between the Natchez territory below Tennessee and Kentucky, they called it Florida Occidental. Okay, and it's everything above West Florida, what today you would call Mississippi, Alabama, right? That was
Mhm.
carved up into those two, but it doesn't seem they had much presence, mainly because it was so sparse. It
Sure.
was so hard to get to. There wasn't a lot of resources. If it wasn't on the coast, they weren't interested. If it wasn't on the river, they weren't interested. So you just have those forts, which I show in the map. And the Yazoo is kind of the only thing that connects the American colonies to New Orleans. I mean, it's this obvious. If you're going to go over land, you're going to go over the Appalachian Mountains, and you're either going to take the Ohio, or you're going to go further south, and you're going to follow the Yazoo all the way down. It's the obvious navigable routes for the in the 18th century. Okay,
Yeah.
and so it ends up just becoming, you know, they fight over it, but not really. It's weird. Georgia claimed it. The state of Georgia thought it was West Georgia. They had a name for it. When the Americans and British decided after the Revolutionary War that, hey, this is yours, Spain's like, no, no, wait, you're deciding on our stuff. That's our property. Y'all can't battle over this area. This is, you know, this is not even for you to decide. And they had almost no power. So I gather if they weren't really pushing for it, they probably had very little presence.
Yeah.
there, you know.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. Great presentation.
There is a marker. I just put this in the comments. There is a marker to Galvez on the banks of the Mississippi, right there, downtown Natchez. So
Okay.
they mentioned Spanish, you know, Spanish territories and all, but not about, you know, not about this.
Because I was curious, I looked it up, and I mean, y'all probably know this already, but New Madrid is still it's a town along the Mississippi, halfway between Memphis and St. Louis. And There is a New Madrid historical museum there, so be interesting to see sometime.
I was told at some point that, or at least I uncovered at some point, when the French tried to come in 1793, that history was actually lost, as in it's recently discovered in the late 20th century that historians were digging in French archives and found, apparently this was, you know, these were state secrets, right? This would have been classified information at the time, if you could think of it like that, for the Kingdom of France. And I guess some of that information, those plots got buried. Well, this one was only uncovered in the last maybe 30, 40 years. They figured that out, that wow, France actually tried to take that part of Louisiana back after they lost it. So, I mean, things like that, that's fascinating to me. I didn't even think about that, you know. So
Cool. All right. Well, no one else has any more questions. Thank you all so much for joining. Look for information on my next letter about upcoming meetings. Like I mentioned before, we're probably going to be changing up the meeting schedule, but I'll let you all know in my next email update. And if for some reason you're not receiving my emails, please send me an email at president@canaryislanders.org and let me know so I can make sure you're on the list. And I'll see you all next time. Thanks.